Don't know if I got, but I hope I did.
Okay, how about now?
Youri is recording the call. I see it.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are rejoined by our returning champion, David Swanson of World Beyond War, also the host of Talk Nation Radio on Pacifica Network, which David also has now on YouTube, on his own YouTube channel, which I'll make sure people can link to. And well, David, before I get to my question, I know that World Beyond War is organizing a 4-day event, I believe, in early July. Please tell folks what this is all about, and if they're interested, how they can sign up and all that stuff.
Thank you, Youri. Yeah, worldbeyondwar.org is the website. We have endless events all the time. I think you're referring to our annual conference, which is our big deal of an event every year, which this year, as the past couple years, will be online. And I think it's July 8th through 10th. And you can go to worldbeyondwar.org and you'll find it there.
Perfect. And yeah, and that's a perfect segue to and yes, people should sign up for it, and if people can, people should also donate to World Beyond War and become subscribers to World Beyond War, so they can always be kept up to date to online events, and also and hopefully in the future in-person events when they do happen.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect, and now that's, and yeah, so let's get to one of the big questions I wanted to ask you, which is you several months ago, World Beyond War hosted a debate. I believe it was called on whether wars are ever justifiable, and you are of course opposed to the motion, and I think you did a very good job of making the case why wars are never, why wars are never justifiable. But let me push back a little bit against that and say, what would you say to those who of course are against wars, are anti-imperialists, but they would say that wars are sometimes justifiable? And I think, an example that comes out of my mind is, indigenous people resisting against the expansionist settler colonial regime that was invading their territories, or wars of national liberation like Palestine, Algeria, Kenya, and Vietnam against all of their colonial oppressors and imperialist aggressors.
Yeah, thank you. We often do these debates, in fact, as often as we can find anyone willing to do the other side of them, where we ask people at the beginning of the debate, do you think wars are ever justifiable? Any side of any war can ever be justified? And, a lot of people will say yes. And then we do the debate. And through no particular genius of my own, but mostly through telling people basic facts they've never heard of and asking them to consider a question they've never considered, you end up with many more people saying, no, war can never be justified. And, this debate was like every other one, like every other presentation. You move a bunch of people, at least momentarily, who knows if it sticks, to believing that war can never be justified. And, everybody sends me wild praise about the debate, but then I hear third-hand criticisms of, David really screwed this up, or he shouldn't have acted like that, or he should, so watch the debate and send me your honest feedback, because that's the only way I learn anything. If you're afraid to tell me what I'm screwing up. Now, I think your question, Youri, is a criticism of my debate opponent, who failed to raise the proper objections, right? He should have talked about wars of liberation and Palestine. In fact, quite the contrary. His example of a justifiable war was Israel attacking Palestine, not Palestine attacking Israel, which highlights the fact that with any war, you get equally passionate equally convinced people defending each side, right? I'm hearing constantly from people for whom it is absolutely unimaginable that Russia is not justified in every single thing it's been doing in Ukraine, and people who believe that Ukraine and NATO and the United States are just unthinkable, that they aren't 100%, and these people are equally angry, right? And equally convinced that the other side is just utterly unimaginable. And so, what I say to, do Palestinians have the right to fight back against Israelis? How dare I sit in my comfortable air-conditioned office thousands of miles away and suggest that the Palestinians, miserable and oppressed as they are, don't have the right to fight back? Well, I just don't give a crap about this 18th century language of rights. It doesn't have any meaning, and I'm not dishing out rights to people or taking them away. I have no ability to do such a thing. The question is not, do I have a right to shoot myself in the head, or do I have a right to shoot myself in the foot, or which would be better? The question is, what would be the best thing to do? The best thing to do if you're in Palestine, judging by the successes of past intifadas that were principally nonviolent, that made a great deal of progress, judging by the relative success of nonviolence versus violence, both in Palestine and in thousands of other places around the world, nonviolence is the strongest tool available. This does not mean that in a Palestine where everybody else is using violence to resist the Israelis and the Israelis are using violence, you're going to have a powerful tool using nonviolence in your apartment when the Israelis kick in the door. That's not what it means. It means that if the Palestinians were all organized and their supporters were all organized around the world to use nonviolence en masse, everybody in a coordinated, strategic fashion use nonviolence, it might very well fail miserably and everybody be injured and killed in huge numbers, and those deaths would be far graver catastrophes in the minds of everyone than if those people had just had guns in their hands. Then it wouldn't have been quite so bad somehow. Don't tell me how. But you would have a greater chance, a much greater chance of success. No guarantees, but you would have a much greater chance of succeeding using nonviolence in a coordinated, massive effort than using violence. And if you succeeded, that success would be almost certain to be far longer lasting, because it wouldn't be just a step in an endless campaign of violence from each side. It would be something that might be sustainable.
And when it comes to say a country like like Syria, and regardless of whatever one thinks of the regime, the style of the regime, and the political preference, but let's just focus on the sovereign government that's being aggressed by Western Gulf forces, which Syria is being aggressed, or even Iraq when its sovereignty was violated, the 2003 invasion. Dozens whatever government that was in power, or whatever occupying force, don't they have the right to I mean, if they're being met with violence, don't they have the right to use violence back, more or less?
Not being God and not having found any live or dead human who's ever given a coherent definition to what it would mean to have a right or not have a right in this sort of question, not being able to, go dissect an Iraqi in a laboratory and, here's the right that he turns out he did have this right. It's not a physical thing, right? It's something that we just imagine and cook up. He has the right. He doesn't have the right. What I just don't find that language useful in this context. Sure, what the hell? He's got the right. He's got the right to use violence. He's got the right to use nonviolence. He's got the right to reply by drowning his own family in the Persian Gulf. He's got all kinds of rights, right? But what would be best to do? what would have the greatest chance of doing the most good and the least harm? This is a useful question in my mind, and the question presented to us in the U.S. media, in the corporate media, is always, not in the context of the U.S. attacking Iraq, but in other contexts, where the U.S. is imagining itself under attack, is always violence or nothing. Should we have violence or should we have nothing? So if I say one word against shipping mountains of weapons off to Ukraine, at the cost of tens of billions of dollars, openly professing no ability to control where they go, I'm immediately told by everybody on Facebook and Twitter, so you want to do nothing. So you want to kiss Putin's, these are the choices. But the choices in the real world are actually fight back with violence or millions of alternatives to that, including organized, nonviolent protection. I have friends who are sitting in an activist's house in Western Sahara preventing rapes and torture and murder by the Moroccan occupiers, using U.S. weapons, by the way, by virtue of being U.S. citizens with U.S. passports sitting in that house. Now, they could be U.S. citizens with U.S. passports, but if they had guns, forget it. They would be failing miserably at what they're trying to do. They would be escalating the conflict. It's because they're unarmed civilian protectors and people who matter with the right flavor of passport that they're able to do, excuse me, what they're doing. People who tell you that the Baltic states have not been invaded by Russia because they're NATO members, and Finland needs to be a NATO member, and Sweden needs to be a NATO member. This is to simply erase how the Baltic states kicked the Soviet Union out in the first place, which you're just not allowed to know. Right? And it sounds like
do expand on that. But we're not talking about the Yugoslavian Civil War. We're talking about when Tito was in power and got the Soviet Union out of.
I think there's a tendency to confuse Baltic with Balkan, which are two very different words. Well, not very different words, very similar words. But the Balkan states where Yugoslavia was, I'm not talking about. The Baltic states near the Baltic Sea, near Finland and Sweden, the states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, these countries, we're told very seriously and solemnly, have not been attacked by Russia because they're NATO members and they've got weapons. And this is speculation. You can make a case that it's true or that it's not true. But what we know for a fact is how they kicked the Soviet military out and prevented and turned around Soviet military invasions years ago. I mean, this is established fact, but you're not allowed to know it. And the fact that they did it by singing sounds like some sort of hippie fantasy, right? The fact that Russian tanks rolled in and the people didn't run and hide and they didn't go get weapons. They swarmed the Russian tanks and sang songs. And the fact that this worked, the fact that you can watch a wonderful movie called The Singing Revolution and see how it worked, doesn't get to be part of our knowledge, doesn't get to be part of our history, right? So they have to have nukes or nothing, because other choices are just erased.
Interesting. And that's a perfect segue to this question, which is the very thorny subject of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, I agree with many, anti-imperialists, anti-war voices and organizations and others who do condemn, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think they condemn it because I think, if I understand your point of view, if we are anti-war, that basically means that, we are anti-violence. And if we know what happens with any wars, even if it's a war that we agree with, we know that what happens with wars is, of course, civilians are always, civilians are always the casualties, are always the number one casualties. Then, of course, there's all the buildings and all the destruction that war leads to. So I understand, where you're coming from, and when your organizations say things like, Russia out of Ukraine, NATO out of out of existence. But then, of course, and I think I understand, where you get, sorry, where you get a lot of flack from is, is the people who say, yes, we don't agree with Russia, with Russia using the military, but wasn't Russia backed into a corner due to NATO expansion? And wasn't Russia provoked into doing its invasion of Ukraine because in 2014 there was a coup in Ukraine, and a hostile neighbor was on Russia's borders? And of course, we also know from secret documents that the U.S. and its allies would love to Balkanize Russia, break apart the Russian Federation. So didn't Russia have no choice but to do its military actions in Ukraine?
No, quite clearly, Russia, like the United States, like the Palestinians, like the Estonians, does not have a choice of massive organized violence and destruction or nothing, and doesn't cease to have millions of other choices once it begins using massive organized violence. It continues day after day after day to have millions of other choices that are not continuing to bomb little children in their homes. To be anti-war is actually not to be strictly anti-violence. When I debate these pro-war professors, they don't want to talk about any wars. They want to talk about me and my grandmother in an alleyway in the dark, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about some, religious commitment against violence for the purity of my soul. I'm talking about what it's useful and strategic and beneficial to do in the world. And so to be anti-war is, in fact, not to be vegetarian in between meals, is not to be anti-war in between wars. It's to be anti-war even when there's a war and even when the war is on TV. I mean, there have been dozens of wars, and there are dozens of wars for years now. But there's one that's on TV now, and we're all supposed to stop being anti-war because of that, even though this is one that risks nuclear apocalypse for all of us more than any of the other wars ever. And even though this is one that's going to result in massive starvation due to famines in countries that aren't even going to get mentioned because the people don't look like Ukrainians, we're supposed to suddenly become accepting of war. Look, Russia was this close to having the world on its side. Russia was laughing and mocking the predictions of an invasion, and everybody thought it was hilarious. Russia was the humanitarian benefactor to refugees. We're saving people from the Ukrainian violence, from the U.S. armed Ukrainian shelling of Donbass. We're helping those who need to escape, and we're giving them apartments in Russia and, like 35 cents to live on, whatever it was. But Russia was in a position where it could have been appealing to the world, not only to corrupt, biased international institutions of law and order, but to the people of the world. If Russia had said, we want nonviolent, unarmed resistors to come to the border of Ukraine, I don't know about you, but I would have been there in a heartbeat, no question. Russia didn't want that. And Russia, like the U.S. and NATO from the other side, didn't spend the past 20 years making Ukraine a more peaceful, democratic place, didn't put efforts into kicking the fossil fuels and getting onto clean energy, didn't invest in small d democratic or nonviolent education and training in Ukraine. No, Russia spent these years just like the US trying to manipulate and maneuver and getting control of Ukraine. Whereas, Russia spends 8% what the US does on its military, but Russia could have taken a fraction of that and made Ukraine a paradise. Russia. The question is not which side is more to blame, and the other side, boom, is a bunch of saints. The question is, did Russia have no choice but to start bombing people's houses? Yes, of course it did. Didn't have to start bombing people's houses.
Even if, I think some would sort of push back against that and say some people would push back against that and say that Russia exhausted all of its diplomatic means in not wanting a conflict, but they were left with no choice. And in fact, and if you look at and some of the secret documents of the U.S. and its allies was that they were always trying to provoke Russia into an invasion because that makes our side, the West side, much more easy to sell NATO to the world. And now, of course, you have Ukraine that sees, see, Russia did invade us. Now we have to join NATO and have secret nuclear weapons on our borders and all that stuff. What would you say to both sides of those?
I would say it's crystal clear that the United States and NATO wanted to provoke Russia into a war. It's not up for dispute. It's the topic of Rand Corporation reports and countless emails from USAID and observations from wise participants for years and years. But the fact that someone is trying to provoke you into committing the worst crime on earth doesn't create an excuse for the worst crime on earth. And even the hardcore militarists who love so-called defensive wars and believe that war is totally acceptable if you're attacked are going to point out that Russia was not attacked. It still hasn't been attacked. That Ukraine, in fact, is Ukraine and Russia is Russia. And yes, of course, the United States behavior would be absolutely the exact opposite of what it's been if Russia were involved in Ontario or Cuba. There's no question. But the fact that a monstrous, criminal cartel headquartered in Washington, D.C. would do something is also not an excuse for doing it. We have to demand better if we want to survive on this planet.
All right, interesting. And one of these days, I would love to even host a debate between you and a fellow anti-imperialist, anti-war, and discuss about that, because there are sometimes very there are sometimes very polarizing conversations which are taking place on social media, as the ones that you have described.
I would love that idea. I would love that idea, because I typically end up debating these professors who are defending a very different example of war. They don't want to touch examples of war. They want to talk about dark alleyways, but when pushed, the examples they'll defend are very different from the person who's going to defend Palestine or the Cuban Revolution and so forth. So it'd be a very different debate, and I would love to do it. And you do it in a civil, friendly manner, and everybody gets their 5 minutes and their 10 minutes or whatever. And we don't call names or throw stuff. But it's way more educational. Just like this interview is way more educational than people who all start out 100% agreeing on everything and continue right along that way. So
we'll definitely organize something in the future, and that's a perfect segue. Continuing on with all we've talked about, is this. Now, do you think the problem with any war, and again, regardless of whether one thinks this war is justifiable or this war is purely evil imperialism, versus the resistance, but doesn't it all go back to, if you are, if you do have the mind of an anti-violence thinker, and if we just study any war or conflict, the horrendous acts of violence that are unleashed, even when it's a side that we think is just. So say, the Irish fighting for a reunified Ireland, or any war of liberation where there are some war crimes that do take place, whether it's the Mau Mau or whoever is fighting that war of liberation, because wars always lead to eventually more wars, and because wars, there's always a hurt party. There's always a party that says that this person or this nation killed my killed my family, ruined my business, and I want revenge on them. And of course that then leads to an endless cycle of violence and bloodshed. Is that why you take the position you take, which is that wars are never justifiable, even when it is we go back to the example of Russia invading Ukraine, or Vietnam against their imperial masters, or Syria and Iraq against their Western/Gulf aggressors?
Well, it's hard to draw lessons from thousands of years of warfare and say, because wars have always been this, therefore, because nukes haven't been around very long, and nukes change things. And keeping militaries around, keeping nukes around, and having wars, and having a war now that is very clearly a war between the two governments that have 90% of the nukes in the world, is an incredibly risky sort of madness. So you have to think that your side of that war is so superior, is so morally defensible, that it outweighs the significant risk of obliterating all life on the planet more quickly than we're going to do it with climate and ecosystemic destruction. Then you have to explain what could be happening that would be worse than the war. Right, and so people from each side will try to do it in every war, including the one in Ukraine. But it's a seriously tough argument when you're seeing families blown up and refugee crises and starvation looming. Now you can attach a just cause to any side of any war. People in the United States adore the U.S. Civil War, because how the heck could you end slavery without killing 750,000 people? It's a law of physics. It can't be done, right? And the fact that most of the rest of the world did it just doesn't enter in, because this is the United States. The rest of the world doesn't exist, and so, I mean,
good old American exceptionalism, yeah.
You got and even those who look into it just avoid the possibility that anything else was imaginable, right? So that there was an article published in recent years with the title, "No, Lincoln could not have bought the slaves," right? Even though Washington, D.C. bought the people free, which, yes, it's insane to be paying money to the people who were committing slavery. You should be paying money to the people who've been enslaved, right? But the alternative of killing 750,000 people and generating endless blowback and violence that hasn't gone away yet and shows no sign of doing so, for a war that didn't end slavery, that made slavery worse in places like Alabama, where, this idea that you can take a just cause that everybody agrees with or should agree with and attach it to a war, which wasn't attached to that war until the middle of the war, when people in the North were getting sick of killing and dying for the Union and they wanted to do it for something better than that. It doesn't work, right? When, if we wanted to end mass incarceration in the United States today, one way to do it would be to go to Congress, pass a law ending mass incarceration. Another way to do it would be to pick out some fields, slaughter millions of young people, and then go to Congress and pass a law ending mass incarceration. And we would connect the two, saying, this was a just slaughter because it's connected, but it didn't have to happen, right? You could have just passed the stinking law, and so it's hard to take an actual war and look at all the details and all the alternatives and all the careful maneuvering that was done to avoid peace, and say, well, this war is justified. But imagine you could totally 100% say, here's a war that this side of it anyway is doing vastly more good than harm. It's totally justifiable. You would have to also justify the institution existing, the militaries existing. The money that goes into the militaries kills vastly more people than the wars. And that's going to be true until they go nuclear, right? You could take $30 billion a year and end starvation on the planet. The US Congress just pulled $40 billion out of its and threw it at Ukraine, right? And that's going to kill a lot of people with weapons. It's not going to kill as many people as are going to starve on this planet in the next year, right? So if you look at war as the drain on resources, as the barrier to cooperation among governments that need to be cooperating yesterday on climate and disease and hunger and refugees, if you look at it as the major environmental destroyer that it is, and not just the wars, but the military training, if you look at it as the blockade against the rule of law in the world, if you look at its record of generating hostility and racism and bigotry, the institution is a bigger problem than just one particular war. So you've got to have a war so good that it does more good than harm on its own terms and outweighs all the harm done by keeping the institution of war around and dumping trillions of dollars into it. Not actually possible.
And second to last question I wanted to ask you then is, in the U.S., and certainly in Canada, there's lots of talks about defunding the police or even abolishing the police altogether as an institution. And you have I'm still and I have to say, I'm still agnostic on the issue, but I'm more and more open to listening to the abolitionist, the abolitionist side of the equation. But when I hear people say that the police, they were founded to be racist, classist organizations, there's no reforming them, and I think, okay, interesting, but then when I ask people, well, where are all the calls about about not only just demilitarizing the world, but even abolishing the military? And I'm always shocked when people say, funny that you mentioned that. It's actually not a big topic amongst all those racial justice, social justice, folks who want to, end the police. So so I'm curious, when you, campaign against, war, militarism, imperialism, and so forth, are, in your, circles, are there any talks about, abolishing the military alongside abolishing, the police? Or
I think abolition is a highly underrated approach. I want to abolish a great many things, many of which are interlocking. When Dr. King said we needed to go after militarism, racism, and materialism, he's talking about abolishing war and abolishing at least a certain form of capitalism, and the things being interlocked, and the need to go after them together, and the notion that we're going to be stronger as activists going after them together, right? I mean, things that used to be just inevitable, decreed from on high, that people have abolished, include witch hunts and trials by ordeal and dueling and owning women and child labor and segregation by race. I mean, these were just, it was just unthinkable. Abolition was crazy talk, right? And yet they've been abolished, or people have been abolished at least up to the point where people understand that abolition is possible and desirable, right? Well, we should abolish war and militarism and police and prisons and the U.S. Supreme Court and the United States Senate and all kinds of grand and broad and specific things. I mean, I'll give you a list of my top 100 things to abolish if you want, but there's no question that police and military have a lot of similarities. And you could say, yes, well, we'll stop giving all the military weapons to the police, and we'll stop the military training of the police, and we'll stop using the police like a military, and then it'll be a good police. Well, no, it'll be a less awful police. But, you know, this notion that you have to have armed troops tell people they're driving their cars too fast. Why? Well, where does that come from? What sense does that make? And so I think it's helpful to people, you know, to talk about alternatives. So, you know, I used to think it was stupid. I used to say, abolish war. What are you going to replace it with? Well, with the absence of war. What the hell? But my colleagues were smart enough to say, let's write a book called A Global Security System, an Alternative to War, and outline what a world looks like with different systems of law and government and economics and social interaction, so that the world is moved against war and war doesn't come back. Well, it's the same with police. People have to understand that, no, you're not saying everybody gets to drive however fast they want. You're saying we'll have people trained specifically in dealing with traffic who don't need weapons to deal with traffic, right? And we'll have people, you know, who understand dealing with de-escalating conflict, deal with de-escalating rather than escalating conflict. And, you know, I mean, it's not been a mystery for the past century that you could put more money into childcare and education and nutrition and a living wage and retirement and healthcare and get better results in terms of crime reduction than you do by putting money into so-called crime reduction. I mean, it's not disputed. It's not a mystery. No sociologist will tell you otherwise, but the political will isn't there. And so it's not, we just stop having the police and we're done. You know, that's not what, you know, it's not, we just blow up all the prisons with all the doors open and we're finished. No, I mean, it's directing resources into other, you know, less expensive in every sense of the word means of addressing societal problems.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, and I think, you know, and I think the problem with, you know, going back to the issue of war, I think the problem with with any war is that is that the violence only leads to more violence, and it gets to a point where people even forget what they're fighting for. They just know that my side is the just side. Therefore, whatever happens to that side, come at it. And I think, if you take the example of Ireland, or more or less, the Troubles. A lot of the times when the IRA did their, attacks in England or even on Northern Ireland, I think it only made people more angry and more willing to say, yes, British government, do whatever you need to do to the IRA terrorists. And my problem with with Russia's actions, even though I fully understand Russia's actions, so I don't want anti-imperialists to think I'm doing a both-sidism and all that stuff. But the problem with Russia's actions in Ukraine is I only think it's going to make people more hostile towards Russia, and the ultra nationalist, Ukrainians, those of the Azov battalion, that's only going to drive more people into their arms, and therefore, like I said, the vicious cycle just goes on and on and on, and we even see this with Israel-Palestine. So your thoughts on that?
Well, now we are agreeing 100%. NATO never could have done for NATO what Russia has done for NATO, and Russia could never have done for Russian militarists what NATO has done for Russian militarists. Where we may lose 100% agreement is on the denunciation of both sidesism, because every issue has at least a couple sides, and everyone in the world has done at least something wrong. And no, of course it's stupid and ridiculous to suggest that any two things are equal. They aren't. But to say, well, if you say something wrong about Syria, you're a U.S. imperialist, and if you say something wrong about U.S. imperialism, you're a pro-Assad, foot kisser. Well, no, actually, Assad's done lots of horrible things, and NATO's done lots of horrible things, and mentioning them does not commit the ridiculous stupidity of equating them, unless you claim that it does, which nobody does. So I think it's actually ought to be acceptable in civil discourse to criticize both sides of a conflict. And if we had an international criminal court not just for Africans, and not just for Africans plus Russians, but an international criminal court, period, that was predictably going to go after both sides in radically different proportions if one side did much more horrible things than the other side, but increasing as the atrocities continued month after month, well, that would be a motivation to end the conflict and negotiate a peace, because the punishments are just piling up, right? But that would be both sidesism. But I agree with you that if you want a lasting success, you do it through nonviolence, not through war. And that once you've got a war going, the biggest excuse, the biggest justification is usually the people who've already died. We got to kill more people to support the people who've already died. And the original justification doesn't even matter anymore. I mean, you recall the U.S. war on Iraq eventually was about the U.S. soldiers who've already died, even though they were like 2% of the people who'd already died, and secondarily about spreading democracy. And all the original justifications, were lost. They went through new ones each year during the course of the war, right? So yeah, I mean, and I agree with you 100% on Ireland. You saw violence fail, and then you saw nonviolence work. And people like Mairead Maguire, who I think you'll agree with on Syria and many other things, did a wonderful job, and many other people, including some otherwise horrible politicians from the United States, did a wonderful job of negotiating peace in Ireland that I hope is going to last, even if Ireland goes through another big change here.
Yeah, and doesn't get we would hope Ireland gets reunited, but of course it's all up to the people. But let's hope that whether it happens or not, that it's all done peacefully, because again, wars, the violence, I in the end of the day, I think war just makes beasts of of human beings, and yeah, and we should be fighting for a world. I like what you said when we hosted the debates about ending the Western Gulf War on Syria, and your opening statement, which you showed me, before we went, live on air, was I'm definitely gonna butcher, but you were saying that we should be building a world where the issue isn't war being the solution, but yeah, sort of something like that. We should be building a world where it's almost unthinkable that the only solution is violence and more violence, right?
I agree. Yeah.
And David, just before I let you go, we still have some time, but you already answered all of my questions, and we already said in the future we'll definitely organize debates on this issue of wars that are being justifiable. But just before I let you go, we usually end the program now with a questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later Bernard Pivot, and later my hero James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. And David, it's your turn to do the questionnaire, so here it goes. David, what is your favorite word?
What is my favorite word? I'm going to have to say peace, I guess.
What's your least favorite word?
What is my least favorite word? I would love to know what Marcel Proust answered for these, but I'm guessing it's a different Marcel Proust. My least favorite word. I don't know if you're going to disqualify this as two words, but can I say human nature?
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, go right ahead. Human nature. And then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
What drives
what turns you on creatively, emotionally, or spiritually?
Well, I guess I want to say just working with other great people for a great cause, and that's certainly partially true. But I suspect one of the reasons I like the debates we were talking about is something to do with competition. It's as much as I denounce where competition goes in international affairs, I suspect myself of enjoying it a little bit. You know.
So working with your wonderful colleagues and a good debate. Then what turns you off then?
I guess what turns me off is doomsayers, predictors of impotence and inability. I think we talk a lot about war propaganda and other propaganda, but the big lie that corporate media sells everybody is that they're powerless. They're powerless, and all they can do is either cheer for a military or vote every couple years. Otherwise, they need to sit down and moan and whine. And when they get up and come to a rally or a meeting and moan and whine, that's not helpful.
And what sound or noise do you love? Followed by what sound or noise do you hate?
What sort of noise?
What sound or noise do you love? And then what sound or noise do you hate?
Sound or noise. Well, this time of year, I don't know if you can hear them, but my yard is so full of birds, and I years and years ago, I've been living in New York City, and then I moved back to a place that had trees in it, and I couldn't sleep for the birds. But now I couldn't sleep without it. So I'll say birds on the first one. And what sort of noise do I?
What sound or noise do you hate then?
Sort of noise do I hate? Of course, we try not to hate things, but how about announcements over intercoms and police radios and security speakers with, with static from robot voices warning me to be careful?
Then what's your favorite curse words?
My favorite curse words. I guess because I don't speak too many languages, but I used to live in Italy. I like to curse in Italian so that people in English don't get too offended. But I still get to curse, and they've got a lot of good ones.
Yes. So you like like the V word then that the Italians use.
can I say that on this program?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
But they also have lots of great just combinations. Dio cane means God is a dog, right? I like dogs, but apparently that's a very bad thing for God to be a dog.
Then, what profession, if you weren't doing the wonderful work that you are doing, what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
Well, I'm doing activism because I couldn't do anything else, so it would be homeless. But I think that if writing books paid as well as writing emails, I would be writing more books and fewer emails, and so there would be more books of more kinds coming out.
What profession would you not want to do under any circumstances then?
Well, there's got to be a long list, right? Any of those 100 things I want abolished, right? I don't want to go work in a coal mine or an oil driller, or but I think any sort of consumption, extractivism, selling widgets, marketing widgets, manufacturing, I don't want to do it. And I know that I buy stuff, and I buy stuff that was made by people and shipped across the world and dug out of the ground by little children. But I try to minimize that, and hypocritically or not, I couldn't work at it.
And the final question, final question before I let you go. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Those idiots were right and you were wrong, because it doesn't, of course, and I think it's important that it doesn't. And I was just looking at the studies yesterday of how the only group in polling in the United States that's serious about protecting the environment are the people who tell you that death is death. And so I actually think, and you can't say this in polite company, but I actually think if we want to protect the world from environmental destruction or nuclear destruction, we have to increase that small percentage of people who believe it's the only world you get. Because of course it is the only world you get.
Okay, I see where you're coming from. Little sneakily trying to avoid the question of that, so to say, hey, we only have this world, guys, so just
how am I supposed to care what some fictional person says when the belief in this fictional person is destroying the earth? I mean, it's my problem.
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with David Swanson of from the brilliant organization World Beyond War, and you heard it here, folks. We will try to organize within the coming months a good debate. And David, just before we end this, remind me, what are the dates of that big conference World Beyond War is going to be organizing?
Yeah, No War 2022 will be July 8th to 10th. And you can go to worldbeyondwar.org and find out all the details and sign up.
And folks, I encourage everyone to do it, especially if you have the financial means to do it. It is going to be money well spent. And until then, David, thank you so much as always for taking the time the time out to come on this program. And let's hope before nuclear war or heaven forbid the climate chaos comes much more quickly than we expect it to. Let's hope that we can build a world. Without war and all of that, right?
Sounds great. Thanks, Youri. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you, David.